The Painful Life of Slaves and Jews by Makayla and Rachel. There were many similarities between slavery and the Holocaust. These similarities are shown in the movie Schindler's List and the novel narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass.
Slavery began when slaves were brought to the colony of Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. They were brought there to aid in the production of profitable crops such as tobacco. Slavery continued in the 17th and 18th centuries. Due to America expanding westward and the North continuing to try to abolish slavery, the nation was torn apart in the Civil War. In the end, the North won and the nation's 4 million slaves were freed. The Holocaust was the mass murder of over 6 million Jews during World War II. According to the Nazis and their leader Adolf Hitler, Jews were an inferior race and were a threat to the German racial purity and community. The Jews were persecuted for many years while the Nazis ruled Germany, and the Holocaust came into effect during the Second World War, killing millions of innocent victims. Both the Jews in Schindler's List and the slaves in the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass had poor living conditions. In the film, the Jews were separated from their families. The men lived in one part of the camp and the women lived in another. They were forced to sleep in crowded, stinky bunkhouses and were starved. They were stripped of their dignity. The slaves in the novel were also separated from their families. The babies were separated from their mothers before reaching 1 year old and sold to other slave owners across the state or even across the country. Some slaves never even knew who their mother was, and they knew them so distantly that during their death they felt little pain. Another example of poor living conditions is the constant state of fear and unknown that the Jews and slaves lived in. In the movie, the Jews were confined to buildings in concentration camps and were forced to work, not knowing when Goethe or another German is going to shoot someone from his balcony. The Jews never knew if they'd be sent to be gassed, switch jobs or camps, or if the rest of their family was even alive. In the book, the slaves were overworked and mistreated. The slave owners would whip them at random, sometimes without reason, forcing the Jews to live in fear. Frederick Douglass described many times how his master would whip the slaves and didn't care what the slave nor their children had to say. The slaves didn't know when they or someone they loved would be whipped. The Jews and the slaves were dehumanized by the Nazis and the slave owners. The Jews weren't valued to most of the Nazis, and that is shown by the way they killed them so thoughtlessly in the gas chambers and so quickly with a bullet. Schindler bought Jews to save them from death and brought them to his factory where they pretended to make bullets, but really just bought them from somewhere else because Schindler knew that the factory would never produce a working bullet. The Nazis put a price to a human's life when Schindler bought them, but they didn't really value them at all. All they cared about was money and power. The slave owners in the book were not much kinder. Upon reaching old age, Frederick Douglass's grandmother was sent out to the woods to die. Her owners didn't see her as any value anymore, as she could no longer work, so they sent her away to fend for herself. This shows how the slave owners never truly valued her as a person. They only cared about what she could do for them. Another example of how Jews were dehumanized in the film is when they were shipped between concentration camps. They were separated between men and women and packed into train cars, which traveled a long distance to Auschwitz. The nations treated the Jews like shipment of packages, both when they were being sent out and when they were arriving at the other camp. They tried getting rid of all the ones who they felt were useless, such as the children and the elderly, and they weren't afraid to kill them since they couldn't work as well as the others. In the book, the slave owners didn't value humans over animals. When the slave owners died, the slaves were divided between their former owners' children based on an evaluation. The owners didn't care about the characters of the people. They just wanted to own the strongest and best working ones. Some slave owners would even value a fat pig over a human who couldn't work.
In the book, it showed a lot of examples of the slave owners whipping their slaves just because they wanted to. Sometimes they would even try to make up something that the slaves were doing wrong so that they could whip them and have it be justified. The slave owners somehow took pleasure in whipping their slaves. An example from the movie of violence of oppressors having nothing to do with the victims in the scene was when Goethe is talking to Helen. Helen doesn't say one word during the time Goethe is down there. He's having a conversation with himself, and it's a way that he is coping with his feelings for her. In the book, it also explains how the slave owners would only cease to stop whipping once they themselves felt tired or sick. Another example from the movie of oppressors killing people just because it's when Girth tries to kill the man who was making hinges. The man was really fast at them, but that day he was ordered to do something else that morning. When Girth came to check on everyone, the man had only a few hinges. He tried to explain that he had to do something else that morning, but Girth didn't care and tried to shoot him anyway. In the book, it shows lots of examples of victims meaning nothing to the oppressors. The oppressors didn't think that the slaves were really people, so they didn't care if one of them was killed or hurt. They didn't even consider it a crime. In the movie, it shows examples of the oppressor, Girth, killing and hurting people just because all of the time. One example of this is when he sits on his balcony and just looks for innocent people to shoot, just for fun. Also in the book, it talks about how slaves were so worthless to them that it costed them barely nothing to kill and bury a slave. Another example of victims meaning nothing to oppressors is when almost all of the children are taken away from the camp to be killed in the big trucks. It almost seems like they are being treated like worthless animals being brought to the slaughterhouse.